This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former senior U.S. intelligence officers and those who research and write about them. Today, we have a very interesting guest who actually appeared at an AFIO lunch in person back in 2015 and gave a great presentation. And we thought for our wider audience and for people who couldn't make that lunch back in 2015, it'd be great to have him on our program. His name is Bryan Denson, and he is a journalist and author. He's written for 5 different U.S. newspapers, including the Oregonian and the Houston Post. He's a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and he is a winner of the George Polk Award. Bryan, welcome to AFIO Now.
Thank you for having me in, Jim.
Bryan, you have a book out. It's been out for a few years now, but it's a very interesting book about U.S. espionage, about treachery. You were a first-time spy writer. How did this story come across your transom?
So, yeah, this really was my first cut. I was working at the Oregonian newspaper here in Portland, and I got a call from a contact of mine in the U.S. Attorney's Office who said, "You're going to want to be in mag court." This is the magistrate's court. This is the where they bring in the freshly arrested folks every afternoon at 1:30 p.m. And I said, "Great, what's going on?" He said, "Really can't tell you." I said, "What do you mean you can't tell me?" And he said, it's a national security case. I said, "Hey, you got 10 minutes? And he said, "Yeah." So I literally jogged over to the courthouse and met with him. And he showed me a story that appeared in 1998. I think it was GQ magazine by David Wise, who is sort of the dean of American spy writers. He's no longer with us, but it was a terrific piece that laid out, and he had an actual interview with Jim, which was one of the last ones Jim would be allowed to do. And so I went back to the office and banged out a story with about a 4-hour head start on everybody else in the world. And so I had a very authoritative piece the next day. And just as a side note to this, I got a call the next day when the story ran from a producer in Hollywood who would later get this story optioned, the book anyway, and the stories I wrote in the Oregonian was optioned for motion pictures with Paramount and Cross Creek Pictures, though it never really went anywhere. The scripts were not great.
So the book is called A Spy's Son. It's about U.S. spy Jim Nicholson. You wrote the first stories back in 2009. What kind of a reaction did you get?
It was pretty immediate. I was besieged with calls from other newspapers. I do recall that. But the one thing that happened that was really interesting is I did get this call from this producer, and he and I formed a kind of a team. And ultimately, he said, "Listen, are you going to write a long form narrative on this?" And I said, "Well, that's what I do. I mean, that's, I'm an investigative reporter, but I like to do a lot of sort of investigative lock picking to get at a really good story." And so he encouraged me to really get to know, the son and Jim. Unfortunately, Jim was not allowed to speak with me. I sent him a couple of letters. And ultimately, I didn't get those letters from Jim, and I only got photocopies from the FBI because they were seized as evidence in the second criminal case.
So you mentioned that you were never able to interview Jim Nicholson. What kind of obstacles did you run into with the U.S. government?
There were multiple obstacles. Jim had signed two plea agreements during his sordid career in espionage, where he agreed that if he were to give an interview, and he did, he gave Katie Couric an interview and some other people. I did a couple of other broadcast interviews, I believe. He wound up being shut down on those interviews ultimately, but he had to have a CIA officer in the room with him as part of the plea agreement. And so I immediately, wrote to Jim. I mean, within days of my very first story coming out, and there were dozens, I think, of stories before it was all over with in the Oregonian, following every development in this the father-son case. And ultimately, Jim was forbidden by the prison system because there's this pesky little law for journalists called Pell versus Pecuniae. I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, and it basically gives the wardens of U.S. prisons the full authority to decide who gets in the prison and who does not. And media in the federal prison system rarely get in for interviews. And in this particular case, because he was a guy with a clearance, I think that was probably bad. On top of that, the Attorney General, Eric Holder Jr. at the time, became kind of a thorn in my butt because he decided that he was going to issue what's known as a special administrative measure, which is a U.S. attorney. It was an Attorney General privilege that basically shuts down someone's right to speak to anyone but a handful of people. In Jim's case, I think there are 6 people who can phone him, and for very short periods of time and very limited. And so I was shut down. The intention was to keep me from interviewing him. I'm certain of that.
And then in 2011, you wrote another series for the Oregonian called The Spy's Kid.
Right.
What determined and when did you decide to turn all this into a book?
Well, I was really lucky. I'll tell you, there was a gentleman named Brian Kelly, who is well known to your membership, who phoned me out of the blue and said, "I've been reading your stories in the Oregonian. I really like the way you write, and I really love these stories." And he says, "You're making a couple of little mistakes. You're calling them CIA agents," and this was early on. And he schooled me and basically became my sensei of all things spy-like, and we became friends. And unfortunately, when in 2011 I was scheduled to speak with Brian at the Spy Museum, he was going to talk about I think the Walker spy case, and I was going to talk about the Nicholson spy cases, and we unfortunately he passed away just before that, but I still have reams of emails from him on guidance on how to do this story. He was a heck of a help. I'm still in touch with his wife, Trish.
Nice. So 2 separate cases were leveled against Jim Nicholson for espionage against the United States. What kind of a character was he?
So I've come to some opinions and some theories, and I, without ever having sat in a room with Jim, I will say that based on voluminous records and interviews he has given, Jim's a bit of a narcissist. I labored for a time under the misapprehension that Jim was maybe a psychopath. Thinking only of himself and moving in the world that way, in that sort of sinister psychopath way. And I did talk to a couple of experts in the field, one of whom was a former CIA officer, Mark Sageman. Both of these guys said Jim is an extreme narcissist. And so based on their evidence and their reading of my stories and so forth, and so that's what I would say. He, and as the assistant U.S. attorney Ethan Knight said in the second case, he said, "This is a man who wakes up every day thinking of Jim Nicholson and only Jim Nicholson." And I think based on the evidence, I would say that he certainly thinks about himself and his place in the world a lot, and he has a very large ego.
Given your understanding of the second case, what could possibly have prompted Jim Nicholson's son, Nathan, to cooperate with his father and pass information to the SVR?
Well, I think I have to take you back to a day in November 1996, the day that Jim was arrested. his son Nathan was 12 years old, and he and his sister Star and their uncle Rob, Jim's brother, had taken Jim to the airport in Jim's minivan, and he was about to be arrested on the tarmac there by Agent Steve Hooper, and that crew in a really cool arrest operation. And so I've forgotten what the question. I'm sorry, I've just lost complete track of
what motivated Nathan.
Oh, yeah. So later that day, two FBI agents showed up at the doorstep, and Nathan, bumped downstairs. I think he was playing with a Sega video game or something, and came downstairs and opened the door, and they said, "We want to talk to your uncle," or wanted to talk to somebody. And so his uncle Rob came out and chatted with them, and that very day, the children were taken out of the house. The house was turned upside down. They cut into the roof and the walls and everything else to find evidence of Jim's espionage. And of course, they'd already they purchased the house next door to run surveillance operations on Jim, electronic ones. So they were keeping pretty close tabs on him anyway. But they did take Nathan and his sister Star to a hotel, and it was, I think, the rest of his life, I think Nathan had just a whole bunch of questions about his relationship with his dad, and I think to this day that relationship is in a sad place, actually, because this is a boy who really lost his father in 1996 to espionage. So, in answer to your question, I think when Nathan was visiting his dad in the prison visiting room, I think he was deeply depressed. I think he was certainly having some serious depression or sadness, certainly, about what had happened to him. And what had happened to Nathan was in about 2004, I believe it was, he had been trying to do what his dad did, become an Army Ranger. And so he was hoping to get into Ranger training, and he was taking basic training. And on his very 13th parachute jump out of a perfectly good C-130, he wound up having an accident. The parachute had been rolled improperly. It was what they call a cigarette roll. It didn't quite fully inflate. It was more of a narrow thing. And so he didn't get the lift, and unfortunately hit the ground very hard and broke a small bone in his back, near his tuchus, his butt. And so Nathan had a disability from the Army, washed out of the Army. He was deeply depressed about this, and at one point suicidal. There's a scene in the book about that. But so I think when he wound up at the prison and was visiting his dad, and his dad came up with this plan to reach back out and use Nathan as a courier, Nathan was in a very vulnerable place, I think. And I think he would tell you that. And what Nathan needed to do was, develop a relationship with his dad, rekindle that relationship and keep it going. And he also needed his dad because he was really wounded by this whole, washing out of the Army thing. He was sort of a hot mess there for a short time. And at a time when he really needed his dad's guidance and hugs and all the things that we need from our fathers, Jim gave him those things, and in my opinion, recruited his son like any garden variety asset he might have worked in around the world, and sent him into the breach.
Bryan, you touched on it lightly, but what is their relationship like today?
Well, there is no relationship. Nathan, under the agreement that Nathan made in court. Let me start over. Nathan made an agreement in court in which he said he was willing not to speak to his father. It was later codified by the court that Nathan could have no contact with his dad. And so Jim has just a very few people he can really speak to, and Nathan is not one of them. And that will be true, I believe, until Jim gets out of the Supermax in Florence, Colorado, here in just a couple of years.
How was the second case of espionage through the son Nathan discovered, and how did the FBI respond?
It's the strangest thing, you know. It's that pesky CIA. You know, there was an analyst or analysts who were all of Jim's phone calls between anybody he spoke to. Not only were recorded by the prison system, the U.S. Bureau of Prisons, they were also recorded by the CIA, and so analysts there were listening to his every utterance he made. And you'd think that that would be a hard way to, you know, figure out whether he was doing something wrong. But in one case, once he had Nathan on the road, Nathan was returning from San Francisco, and there's this really sort of telling snippet of that phone call where Jim says, "Hey, son, how you doing?" And he says, "Doing fine, Pa, doing fine." And he says, he said, I really enjoyed meeting them, or something like that. They were nice people. And what he was referring to, of course, is the two Russian SVR officers that he met in the San Francisco consulate, now closed. And ultimately, he said, made a sale for $5,000, and he was trying to make it sound like it was his booming insurance sales. Nathan was a really lousy insurance salesman. In fact, he was lousy because he couldn't sell elderly people on insurance policies because he didn't feel right doing it. And so I think he made a couple very small sales at one point, but that was sort of Nathan.
Well, it's an amazing story. And it's great to get it firsthand from the researcher and writer who did all the work. The name of the book is The Spy's Son by Bryan Denson. And I encourage you all to take a look at it. And I want to thank Bryan for a very interesting interview.
Very happy to do it. Thank you very much, Jim.